30 days ago, insurrectionists stormed the U.S. Capitol. This week, the building was a place of mourning and honor for Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, who was killed in the raid. Members of Congress I've spoken with are still raw about the riot, and that state of personal crisis is steering big political decisions right now. Republican leaders are desperate to unify their party. House Republicans voted overwhelmingly to keep Wyoming Congresswoman Liz Cheney, who voted to impeach Trump, in her job as their number 3 leader. And Republicans backed Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, under fire for false and incendiary remarks she said in the past. Greene said this week that she's a different woman now, but 11 Republicans and hundreds of Democrats didn't buy it, voting to strip her of committee assignments Thursday. A Republican divide, with some trying to make room for Greene.
The voters decided she could come and serve.
And others now pushing to reject President Trump.
What Americans saw 3 weeks ago was ugly. Shameful mob violence to disrupt a constitutionally mandated meeting of the Congress to affirm that peaceful transfer of power. It happened because the president lied to you.
Joining us tonight for this 2021 roller coaster ride are 4 reporters covering all things Washington. Jonathan Martin, national political correspondent for the New York Times. Alexi McCammond, political reporter for Axios. Jake Sherman, founder of Punchbowl News, a political newsletter. And Sabrina Siddiqui, White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Thank you all so much for joining us. Jake, let's get right to it. Let's start with you. I see you in the halls of the Capitol talking to the Republican lawmakers all the time. Take us into their mindset right now. How are the events of January 6th affecting them personally, and how did that affect their actions this week?
Thank you, Lisa. Great to be with you. A few things. Everything changed after January 6th. There's no question about that, no doubts about that in the Capitol. I think both parties are trying to find a new normal, and I think Republicans have gone through a tumultuous civil war in the last couple days in which they were trying to, as you mentioned, knock off the number 3 leader in the House Republican Conference. They had Liz Cheney. They were trying to grapple with Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has had a history of very, very offensive, racist, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, and conspiracy-laced charges. And on the Democratic side, they're living with a Republican Party that they see as being guilty, and rightfully so in some sense, that they see as being guilty and responsible for the violence January 6th, if not directly. No one's saying that they directly were responsible for the violence, but these were supporters of theirs and Donald Trump who came and sacked the Capitol. And I had one Democratic lawmaker say to me, every time we see some of these lawmakers, including Marjorie Taylor Greene, we think of that day. And Lisa, you know this, and we all are up in the Capitol all the time. I think everyone is going through some sort of PTSD from that day, which was deeply troubling, and for all of us, for staff, for reporters, for members, and for aides. And I think that's very, very acute with members of Congress.
Sabrina, I want to ask you, the view from the White House, which is now really a place of relative calm in Washington as President Biden gets started. How do they look at this sort of GOP turmoil? Is that something that Democrats think they can take advantage of, or counterintuitively, is it too much turmoil? Is it a problem for the Biden White House?
Well, I think that the approach so far that we've seen from the White House is to really stay out of the civil war that continues to unfold within the Republican Party. They don't really see a political upside in really getting into whether or not there should be people who are held accountable for the events of January 6th. Instead, they've invested their political capital on negotiations over a coronavirus relief package and pointed out that President Biden has taken office against the backdrop of a pandemic as well as an economic recession. And so that's where his focus is. There have been multiple occasions in the White House briefing room where Press Secretary Jen Psaki has been asked, for example, about Marjorie Taylor Greene, and her response has been, we're not going to comment on any one lawmaker, and they don't want to elevate conspiracy theories from the White House podium or really give her much of a platform. So that has really been the approach. And I think it really is born out of what President Biden said he would do, which is focus more on extending, bipartisanship and trying to work with Republicans to pass some kind of coronavirus relief package, not really get involved in the politics of what the future of the Republican Party looks like since former President Trump left office.
Alexi, I want to talk to you about progressive Democrats who have waited for this moment, right, to be in power in the White House and in Congress. But there's so much emotion there for progressives. Can you talk to me about how progressives are weighing this emotion and fundraising off of things like Marjorie Taylor Greene, along with trying to pragmatically get some agenda through? What is the mindset right now for the left part of the Democratic Party?
Well, of course, the most obvious example this week was Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who had a really emotional, raw, and harrowing account on her Instagram Live earlier this week about her personal experience during the insurrection on January 6th. You saw something similar from her colleague and member of the so-called squad, progressive, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who got really emotional when she was speaking about this on the House floor. You saw Congressman Steny Hoyer bring up that photo from Facebook of Marjorie Taylor Greene holding a gun that was photoshopped next to other members of the so-called squad to really show that these progressive members of the party have been targeted by these folks, these insurrectionists, and are really feeling uncomfortable in this moment. Freshman member Congresswoman Cori Bush, she moved her office, which was close to Marjorie Taylor Greene's earlier this week, because she felt uncomfortable after an altercation that they had in the hallways earlier this week. So we see how they're really speaking out and sharing these raw accounts of what's been happening. And at the same time, as you mentioned, Lisa, they've been working really hard trying to be collective, especially the Congressional Progressive Caucus, as a voting bloc to push Pelosi, Schumer, and President Biden on certain things that they consider non-negotiables for the COVID package. They don't want to see the number lower than $1.9 trillion. They've been lobbying inside and outside for $15 minimum wage to be included. Yesterday, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal said that when she got wind that might not be included in the package, she called the White House and said, hey, could you have President Biden tweet from the POTUS account in support of including a $15 minimum wage? But as we might learn very soon, Lisa, a tweet might not necessarily mean it's going to be policy. A $15 minimum wage, although progressives have been lobbying, might not end up in the eventual package.
That alone is a big change from the Trump administration. We're going to come back to the COVID relief package. That's a very important topic. Jonathan Martin, I know you were on Capitol Hill today. I missed you. We were on different sides of the Capitol. But I think you can get the theme I'm getting at here. The emotion at the U.S. Capitol after January 6th. Can you help us understand? Let's kind of get away from the Washington, all the Washington stuff. What does this mean for regular Americans, and what does this mean for our government, do you think, for the next few years? Is this where we're going to be for a long time?
Yeah, I mean, I can't recall a moment in our country's recent history when politics was this poisonous. And by that I mean when there was a kind of level of contempt and disdain between the two parties, that they don't just view the other as the opposition. In a lot of cases, they view the other as something even worse than an adversary, short of an enemy, but not far from it. And I think we see that increasingly in communities and states. Politics has gotten so darn polarized, and obviously that's reflected with people's lawmakers in Washington and in state capitals. You just don't have the kind of friendly relationships, across the aisle relationships anymore, and especially with a sort of newer generation of members coming in who are sort of much more attuned to the base of their party. And frankly, like Lisa, the incentive structure is now different for them. You know, you talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, who was stripped of her committees. That didn't stop her from having a press conference today with lots of cameras, and I think she was plenty happy to have the cameras there, probably more so about that than she was disappointed to lose her committees.
I was at that press conference, and she definitely seemed to be in full energy, full gusto, enjoying that spotlight right there. I want to talk a little bit more beyond the lawmakers about what's driving all of this and what's happening to Americans also. Jake, you know, I don't know if you remember, the last time I saw you was January 6th. You and I were among maybe 2 or 3, 4 people that were standing there watching together the rioters break through that front door of the U.S. Capitol in that extraordinary moment. And I want to ask you about this other layer, which is, What did you make of who the rioters were and what was driving them?
It's a good question. I think in the moment, none of us, I mean, we all knew that they were coming from the White House, from the rally at the White House, and what's driving them. They, Jonathan and I were talking about this today. I mean, this is politics as almost a cult, right? I mean, this, if not a cult, certainly a cult of personality around the president. And the president led his supporters to believe that there was some sort of nefarious plot to steal an election from him, an election that he clearly lost, that there's no evidence was rigged or was tampered with in any way. So I think that's the main core of it, right? I mean, I think there's this group of people who listen to what the president says and, were not involved in politics before him, might not be involved in politics after him, and they hang on every word. And every word he said for weeks was the vice president could overturn this, he could reverse this. And I think that's what's driving them. I think that, and that's why a lot of them were not wearing masks, because the president, said you don't have to wear masks for many, many months before then saying you have to wear masks. So I think that's what I think was driving this. But in the moment, Lisa, I don't think any of us, we were just making sure we weren't going to get, bowled over. But I mean, that's what I think is their general theory of the case.
I'll say, being up there, I did, in that moment, absolutely. It was all about, let's make sure we get to a safe place, because there weren't any police officers right around us at that point. But later, as I was out there with the rioters, it struck me there was such a strange group of some people who clearly didn't know what they were doing, were surprised they ended up in the Capitol, right. Others who were very focused. It was wild. And
yeah, it was. And I think that some of them were along for the ride, but the vast majority of them walked into a building they knew they weren't supposed to walk into in a manner they knew that they were not supposed to, walk into the building. So I think they do deserve some blame for that.
Oh, 100%. And I think that brings us to the question coming up before us next week is, how much is President Trump to blame for this? Jonathan Martin, I'm going to ask you to do something tricky. Briefly tell us about this massive and really excellent piece that you did for the New York Times with others on the 77 days leading up in the White House. What did you learn about the last days of President Trump and what he was doing that may have had a role leading up to this riot?
People who knew the president well, who worked with him, in some cases in Congress, in other cases literally his own staffers, Lisa, they thought that he was just doing kind of Trumpian bluffing, that he knew he had lost the election and that he just wanted to kind of salvage his legacy the best he could, and so he was doing this shtick. And I think as the days went on, it became clear to them that somebody who, had done kind of Trumpian bluffing before, but, would eventually come to his senses on policy issue X, that this case was different and that he actually was starting to believe some of the BS that was being fed to him by the more, shall we say, colorful advisors who were in his ear. And that, obviously by early January, he clearly believed that he had won the election, that it was not just him trying to sort of look for an escape hatch to salvage his legacy, but he was actually trying to legitimately hang on to power, and that he was putting real pressure on Mike Pence to kind of do his bidding. And I think at that point, people were really alarmed, both in the White House and in Congress.
So we now have an impeachment trial again. I joked to someone earlier, it's not my first impeachment trial, which is a bizarre thing to say. Alexi, I want to ask you, can you lay out what are the basic arguments here for both sides? From the Democrats saying he must be convicted, and from the Republicans, from President Trump and his team saying no.
Well, the Republican argument is pretty easy. They're kind of mirroring what President Trump or former President Trump and his lawyers are saying, which is that it's unconstitutional for a former president to be tried by the Senate. Now, to be sure, many legal scholars agree that that is not the case, that a former president can be tried by the Senate, but that is what Republicans are going to argue, on top of the fact that they will say that this is a partisan exercise by Democrats, a political show, as some have described it. Democrats, of course, submitted one article of impeachment. They are trying to make the argument that former President Trump's words directly incited the insurrection at the Capitol. They're also going to argue that former President Trump didn't do anything to stop the mayhem that day. And they're going to remind folks of the violence and terror that members on both sides of the aisle experienced that day to really kind of hold Republicans' feet to the fire. And that, Lisa, to me, is the big picture. Both sides, to be sure, are making an argument about the other side, but it's really about the court of public opinion. It's about branding the party to the American people, especially ahead of the 2022 midterms, but especially as both parties are sort of undergoing a little bit of an identity crisis and a rebranding moment under a new administration and post-President Trump.